Over 13% of Americans suffer from some form of asthma, and this puts them at a huge disadvantage compared to other people. And most people think that the only way to deal with their asthma is to keep suffering and to carry an inhaler everywhere. And some people even give up exercising entirely because there's no way they can breathe when they're exercising. But none of these solutions actually solve the problem, and they're all actually making your quality of life worse. But the good news is there is a way to actually help fix your asthma. And there's a way to actually improve your quality of life, get rid of those medications, and start breathing easier. So stick with me and I'll show you how. So when you have asthma, your breathing tubes start to shrink. And they actually shrink so much that it makes it so much harder for you to breathe, especially when you're exercising. And the longer you actually wait to fix the cause of this asthma, the more you give this asthma a chance to actually get worse and cause other symptoms and cause other diseases and potentially even lower your lifespan. Now, asthma doesn't always get worse. Sometimes you'll notice that it actually gets better over time. And some people don't even rely on their inhaler anymore when they get older. But at the same time, there are people that suffer with their asthma long throughout their life, and it even gets worse for some people. So normally what medicine tells us is to carry an inhaler around and to avoid triggers. Now, this is some good advice, but it's not always practical. So triggers are things like pollutants or different dust or different particles that can actually trigger an asthma attack and make those symptoms start to appear. But it's not always practical to avoid that. I mean, if you live in an area that's really dusty, how can you just tell someone to not go outside? But there are other things that do get to the root of the problem with asthma. And one of those things is changing the way that you breathe. So one thing that's common among anyone that has asthma is that they breathe more than the average person. So a normal healthy person should be breathing about 5 to 6 liters of air per minute. But someone with asthma is going to breathe about 10 to 15 liters of air per minute. So that means an asthma person is going to breathe 2 to 3 times more than the required amount of air. So that means that their lungs, their breathing tubes, their whole respiratory center, it's all working 2 to 3 times harder for doing the same thing as an average person. So what causes this? What causes someone to develop asthma and develop a narrowing of their breathing tubes to make it harder for them to breathe? Well, it could be a change in lifestyle. So there is a trend that the more wealthy you get, the more likely you are to have asthma. So does this mean that having more money actually causes asthma? Obviously not, right? But wealthy people live a very different lifestyle than most other people. One thing that wealthy people tend to do is they can have other people do their tasks for them. So they have a less active lifestyle. They tend to be more lazy or sedentary. But also with wealthy people, they tend to live a more clean lifestyle. And you'll see that living a more clean lifestyle can actually correlate with having more asthma. Also, wealthy people tend to eat more processed foods. Now, you might see some billionaires on the internet that are eating these nice home-cooked meals, but the vast majority of wealthy people tend to eat more processed, unhealthy foods. And if you don't believe me, look back in history. I mean, what happened when sugar was seen as such a valuable item and only the wealthy people were able to attain sugar? Well, only the wealthy people were getting unhealthy from eating so much sugar, right? So now these changes in your lifestyle are going to start to affect your breathing. And I'm not just talking about wealthy people. This can affect literally anyone. A normal way to breathe is to only use your nose and to only use your diaphragm and to have these soft, silent, kind of non-existent breaths. But people who have asthma tend to do the opposite. They tend to breathe through their mouth a lot. They tend to sigh a lot throughout the day. You'll see them only using their upper chest to breathe. So their breathing just overall looks a lot more unhealthy than a normal person. But this is part of the problem. Mouth breathing in people that have asthma is so terrible for you, and it's actually making it worse. So first off, mouth breathing will lead to more inflammation in your lungs. And the reason is it doesn't filter out any of that air. When you breathe through your nose, you have this hair in your nose and you have this mucus in your nose, and this will capture different dust and particles and also viruses and bacteria, and it'll filter a lot of that out before it reaches your lungs. On the other hand, when you breathe through your mouth, you don't filter out anything. and all of this dust and particles is going straight into your lungs. So this is a reason why people who breathe through their mouth are more likely to get sick, because they're not getting any of this filtering done. And also, mouth breathing does not temper the air at all, meaning it does not change the temperature of the air that's going into your lungs. On the other hand, when you breathe through your nose, this air will change to your body temperature, and the air will also get humidified. This makes it a lot easier on our lungs. And when we breathe through our mouth and we inhale this dry, cold air, then our lungs are going to be more likely to get inflamed and just not like this air. It's going to get kind of irritated. And also, when you're breathing through your mouth, your breathing volume is higher. So you're breathing more air. And this goes back to asthma patients and why they're breathing 2 to 3 times the amount of air as a normal person. Because when you breathe through your mouth, you're taking these big, giant gulps of air. As opposed to breathing through your nose, you're taking these smaller breaths. And lastly, people who breathe through their mouth, they do not get the benefits of nitric oxide. So when you breathe through your nose, this air goes through something called your paranasal sinuses. Your paranasal sinuses are very important because when air passes through them, it produces a molecule called nitric oxide. Now, nitric oxide does 2 very important things. One is it is a vasodilator, meaning it can dilate our blood vessels. So this makes it easier for oxygen to be carried around in our blood, and it also increases the efficiency of our breathing because it allows the oxygen and carbon dioxide in our body to be exchanged a lot easier. And the second thing that nitric oxide does is it is an antibacterial, meaning it can fight off bacterial infections and help keep our whole airway area clean and prevent us, again, from getting sick. So if you're seeing all of these negative effects of breathing through your mouth and breathing too excessively, and all of these are common features of people that have asthma, it would make sense to try to get this asthma patient to reduce their breathing and try to only breathe through their nose. And luckily, there are studies showing that this can actually help. If you can comfortably hold your breath for 40 seconds. Now, the key word here is comfortably. I'm going to get to that in a second. But if you can comfortably hold your breath for 40 seconds, then you can basically consider yourself asthma-free. Now, what do I mean when I say comfortably holding your breath? Well, I don't mean holding it as long as possible until you're gasping for air. I mean holding it for 40 seconds, and then after 40 seconds, you have this small urge to breathe. And you don't have to recover at all. So after those 40 seconds are up, then you can just resume normal breathing. Now, some of you may be looking at me like I'm crazy. Like, how could anyone possibly comfortably hold their breath that long? Well, I hate to break it to you, but people can do that. And that is what's supposed to be normal. There's a quote from the book Exercise Physiology, and it says, if a person breath holds after a normal exhalation, it takes approximately 40 seconds before the urge to breathe increases enough to initiate inspiration. Now, what the heck does that mean? Basically, it means what I just told you. If you take a normal inhale and exhale, so like this, and after that exhale, and you hold your breath, it should take you approximately 40 seconds before you have any urge to breathe. So what is an urge to breathe? That is when your breathing tubes start to contract a little bit, or when your diaphragm starts to contract a little bit, or when you start to have this urge to swallow, or your throat starts to contract. When you get any of these involuntary muscle contractions, that is your first urge to breathe. Now, again, it doesn't mean that you should be gasping for air. After you have that urge, you should be able to resume normal breathing normally. Now, if you try this and you can't do this, don't be discouraged because a lot of people cannot do this. Most athletes can only get about 20 seconds. But you'll see that increasing this number is going to be very important. And it's going to be very vital to not only fixing your asthma, but also improving your overall health and your overall athletic performance. So when it comes to fighting asthma, it comes down to 3 things. Number 1 is to only use your nose to breathe. Number 2 is to warm up before your workouts. And number 3, like I said, is to be able to comfortably hold your breath for a longer period of time. Now, I'm going to go over all 3 of those in detail. The reason that these 3 things are so important is because they're all increasing your CO2 tolerance or your carbon dioxide tolerance. People with asthma breathe more, and as a result, they release more carbon dioxide because anytime that you breathe in, you're breathing in oxygen, but anytime you breathe out, you're releasing carbon dioxide. Anyone that breathes too much is going to release too much carbon dioxide. The problem with releasing too much CO2 is you get a condition called hypocapnia. And hypocapnia comes with a lot of negative symptoms. So anytime you lose CO2, your breathing muscles will start to contract. And also, all of the smooth muscles and all of the basically vessels and arteries and veins in your body will also contract. So basically, all the tubes in your body are going to start to shrink. And as a result, it's going to be harder for you to breathe, and it's also going to be harder for that oxygen that's traveling in your blood to go to your cells. Now, this is where you can start to get different symptoms. Symptoms like wheezing or coughing, being out of breath, or just it being hard to breathe in general. Now, this ends up turning into a never-ending cycle because now that your breathing tubes start to contract and you're starting to get this breathlessness, you start to try to intake more oxygen. And this is natural, right? When you're out of breath, what do? Most people try to take these big gulps of air. But this is the problem. It's actually doing more harm than good because now you're taking these big gulps and now you're expelling more CO2 and you're never able to get that oxygen properly delivered to your cells because everything is getting too constricted. On the other hand, if you increase your CO2, it actually opens up the airways and it opens up the blood vessels. It dilates everything and it makes it not only easier to breathe, it also makes it easier for that oxygen to get transported to all of your cells like your brain. And there's been studies on this where they give asthma patients more CO2 and they show that it actually improves their asthma. So you can see that the goal should be to naturally increase your CO2 tolerance and increase your CO2 levels so that you can naturally get all of these benefits. And there were studies showing that this can actually be done. So there was a study at the Mater Hospital in Brisbane, and they took these asthma patients who had a breathing volume on average of 14 liters per minute. And they basically reduced their breathing volume, and they were trying to see if this would resolve any of their symptoms. So what they did was they reduced their breathing volume from 14 liters per minute to 9.6 liters per minute. So still above what a normal healthy person should be breathing. But their asthma symptoms went down by 70%. Not only that, their use of an inhaler dropped by 90%, and their use of any steroid medications dropped by 50%. So this is showing that there is a direct relationship between the amount or the volume of air that you are consuming and your asthma symptoms. And it also shows that the closer that this volume of air that you're breathing gets to a normal level, then the more your asthma symptoms will be resolved. Now, there was another study also showing the importance of CO2. So they took these 3 different groups and they induced a condition of hypoxia. Hypoxia is basically when you have a lower amount of oxygen. So when you go up to a higher altitude, like Colorado or in the mountains, you have a lower amount of oxygen available. So they're basically simulating a condition where there is less oxygen available. As a result, obviously their oxygen levels dropped. But the 3 different groups were, one was a control, and the other 2 actually had carbon dioxide infused in that air. So the first carbon dioxide group had 3% carbon dioxide infused in their air, and the third group had 5% CO2 infused in that air. And the results were really interesting. The control group, quickly their oxygen levels dropped, and it took a really long time to come back. But the groups that had CO2 infused in their air, their oxygen levels did not drop a whole lot, and they actually recovered a lot quicker. And what's even more interesting is that the group that had carbon dioxide infused in their air, not only did they recover to baseline really quickly, they actually improved their oxygen levels. So compared to the control before, when they didn't have any hypoxia or anything, and after the hypoxia and after they recovered, the group that had more CO2 in their air actually had higher oxygen levels. So having more CO2 basically delivers more oxygen to your cells. And here's the thing, this is not just for people that have asthma anymore. Pretty much anyone is going to benefit from not having so constricted airways. So I think anyone who wants to work out or anyone who just wants to be healthy in general can benefit from increasing their amount of CO2 and following these same protocols. So how else can someone increase their CO2 tolerance and get all of these benefits of opening up their airways and improving their oxygen delivery to their cells? So what are some other ways to actually get these benefits and actually improve the amount of CO2 that's in your body so that you can increase the amount of oxygen that's going to all the right places? Well, this is where other techniques like breath holding can come into play. So there's a reason why asthma patients are more likely to choose swimming and water sports as opposed to other sports. In one study, it was shown that 55% of football players and 50% of basketball players had their airways constricted to the point where it was similar to a person with asthma. So basically, half of these football players and half of these basketball players had asthma. But the same study was done on people who were doing water polo, and pretty much 0% of those people had asthma. That's not a coincidence. There's a reason why asthma patients are picking these water sports. The reason why these water sports, like water polo or swimming, are so popular for people that have asthma is because when you're in the water, there's many times where you're basically forced to hold your breath. Next time you go swimming, you'll see that when your head is underwater, obviously you're holding your breath until you can resurface and breathe. And by doing so, you're basically forcing your body to endure higher levels of CO2. So basically swimming and doing these water sports is acting as a cure for people that have asthma because it's increasing their CO2 tolerance. Now the problem here is it's not entirely being a cure because you cannot solely rely on the swimming. Because first of all, outside of the sport, you have to make sure that they're doing the same techniques of reduced breathing and doing other techniques to increase their CO2 so they can get the benefits. And also the chlorine in the water is probably going to trigger something in some asthma patients as well. But luckily, you don't have to do swimming to get these benefits. There are other ways to get these same benefits and still stay dry on land. And one of them is by practicing breath holding. One of the best gauges for determining someone's fitness level is seeing how long they can comfortably hold their breath. And this is also a great gauge for determining how far or how severe someone's asthma is. And actually, I think everyone should be practicing how long they can comfortably hold their breath, because this is also a really good gauge for your VO2 max level. VO2 max is defined as the maximum rate of oxygen consumption available during exercise. Basically, what that means is when you're exercising, the maximum amount of oxygen that your body can transport. So having higher VO2 max levels is good, and that means that you're at a higher fitness level because your body can carry more oxygen at once. So this is a really good indicator of your overall fitness, but also your endurance, especially for long cardio exercises. So things like cycling or rowing or swimming or going for a long run like cross country. Now, if you go through the steps of increasing your VO2 max, it will also lower the amount of energy required for an activity. Now, some people, when I say that, they get a little upset. They're like, why would you take the easy way out? Why would you want to do something that takes less energy? You got to work hard, man. Well, yeah, obviously you got to work hard, but you also got to work smart too. And this is where you got to have a smart approach to your workouts. So it's about working both hard and smart. For example, if you could run 1 mile and then run it again the next day at the same speed, but only use half the amount of energy, wouldn't it make sense to do that? Because now you can either run that mile faster or you can even run 2 or 3 miles. Generally, an athlete will have a higher VO2 max than an average person. So someone like LeBron James or a UFC fighter, they're probably going to have a higher VO2 max than one of those fans sitting and eating a hot dog and drinking a beer. And the thing is that their training is actually engineered to have a higher VO2 max. This is a very important thing for athletes. And one of the best ways to actually increase your VO2 max, now this may sound counterintuitive, but it's actually to train in conditions that have lower amounts of oxygen and also higher amounts of CO2. This may sound like it's doing the opposite, but conditioning your body to tolerate higher amounts of CO2 and lower amounts of oxygen is going to be the best way to increase your VO2 max. And the reason is when you work out, your body increases its production of CO2. Now, this is the same CO2 that your body exhales when you breathe out. As a result, your breathing will naturally increase when you work out to get rid of this excess CO2 that's building up. But the more conditioned that you are, the more CO2 that you're able to tolerate. So the less that you'll have to breathe because you can actually retain more of that CO2. This is exactly why people who work out more tend to breathe less during their workouts than people who have never worked out in their life before and then they try to work out one day. But the problem is this is simply not enough. especially in our modern society. In our modern society, there are so many different things now that are negatively affecting our breathing. The main two are processed foods and chronic stress. And because of these things, we have to do more than just physical exercise to actually improve our VO2 max and improve our oxygen carrying efficiency. But now this is where working smart comes into play. And it's going to come down to three things. Number one is to reduce the amount of air you need to breathe throughout the day. Number two is to increase the amount of time you can comfortably hold your breath. And number three is to simulate high altitude training. And that doesn't mean having to go to Colorado. You can simply do that at home, and I'm going to show you how. Luckily, all three of these things will go hand in hand. So they're all going to help each other. If you do one of these things, it's going to help you improve the other two things. So first off, comfortably holding your breath. Your goal here should be 40 seconds. Now, I'm not talking about going all out and holding it as long as you possibly can. I talked about this before, but the way to do this is to take a normal inhale and exhale. And after the exhale, you hold your breath and you see how long it takes for you to have an involuntary urge to breathe. So this can present as a few different symptoms. Like sometimes it's an urge to swallow, or sometimes you'll feel your throat or your chest or your stomach start to contract. Any of these involuntary movements are basically your first urge to breathe. Now, most people will not even be close to that 40-second mark. I think I recently got up to 30 seconds, but I've been practicing this for a while. And most athletes only get up to 20 seconds. So you might be wondering, what's the big deal? And if athletes don't even have this 40-second mark, why should I be doing it? Well, the reason that most people cannot do this is, again, because our modern society has changed so rapidly that what's considered normal breathing has changed. So that means that even athletes can benefit from this and get an advantage over their competitors. And you can imagine for an athlete, even a 1% advantage over someone is going to be a big deal. But for the average person, this is going to improve your overall health. So not only is it going to improve your oxygen carrying efficiency, improve the amount of oxygen that's going to your cells, it can help prevent you from being chronically tired. It can also help improve anxiety. And I'm going to get into more of that later in this podcast. So it's best to measure this breath hold when you are well rested. So a good time to do it is right in the morning and not having exerted yourself and practicing it. If you do it after a workout, it's generally going to be higher, so it's not going to be as accurate. And the reason is because after a workout, your body is used to having this higher amount of CO2 because you just did a full workout where your body was producing CO2. So your body's going to be more CO2 tolerant at that time. Now, the second thing that comes down to increasing your VO2 max is reducing your breathing throughout the day. So the best way to do this is to simply only use your nose to breathe at all times. So the way you do this will kind of depend on what your breath hold score was. So let's say you had a breath hold score of closer to 40 seconds or even 20 seconds. You should be able to generally breathe through your nose pretty well. But let's say it's down to 10 seconds or less. Well, now your main focus should be just on trying to breathe through your nose anytime during the day when you're not working out. But if your breath hold time was higher and closer to that 40-second mark or above that 20-second mark, your goal should be to try to only breathe through your nose, not just during the daytime, but also when you're exercising. Now, you may look at me like I'm crazy because if you only breathe through your nose when you're working out, then you're probably not going to work out as hard. Well, there's actually studies on this. So the first 2 weeks of trying to breathe through your nose during your workout, your performance will actually decline a little bit. But if you keep it up for 2 weeks, then your performance will actually increase and be better than it was before. And not only that, you will be at a higher advantage because you can do that whole workout the same that you did before by only using your nose. So that way, when it comes to a major competition or something like that, then you can resort to mouth breathing at a later time. That's the whole goal here. It's to breathe through your nose as much as possible during your workout until you have to get to that point where you have to breathe through your mouth. And we're trying to delay that point as much as possible. Now, another way to reduce the amount of breathing is to focus on using your diaphragm. Now, this is something else that's also very important. So your diaphragm is this muscle that rests right below your lungs. And the way to engage your diaphragm is going to be by basically placing your hands right above your belly button. And when you breathe in, you want to see if you're kind of pushing your hands out. If you don't feel your hands being moved and you only see the upper half of your chest being moved, then you're not breathing correctly. You want to focus on pushing your hands out. Now, if you still cannot do this when you're breathing, you might want to try just using your diaphragm when you're not breathing. So Basically, just focus on engaging your diaphragm first, and then you can focus on engaging your diaphragm while breathing. The way to do that is don't even focus on your breathing. Just put your hands in the same spot and try to push your gut out and try to push your hands out. And keep doing this for about 10 minutes or so. And just kind of go in, focus on your abdomen moving out, and then focus on your abdomen moving back in. You can also try this laying on your back and putting a book right over your belly and try to push that book up and down by simply using your belly. After you do that for a while, you'll kind of see how it is to engage your diaphragm. Then you can try to incorporate using that diaphragm in your breathing. Now, the third way to increase your VO2 max, this is the most fun one, is high altitude training. Now, I'm not telling you to go to some mountains in Kenya or mountains in Colorado to try simulating this high altitude training by training at the top of these mountains. You don't have to do that. You can actually take those mountains to your house. Not literally, but you can trick your brain and your body into thinking that it's in a high altitude condition. So there's 3 different ways you can do this, and I want you to do all 3. One is during your warm-ups before you work out, and number 2 is during your actual workout, and number 3 is just throughout the day. So let's talk about the warm-ups first. First up, if you do any workout, you want to make sure that you warm up. And this is going to be the first step to your high altitude training. Warming up is very important because you're basically telling your body to anticipate a higher amount of CO2. So have you ever had that feeling where you're going for a run and you start running and immediately you start to feel breathless? You're like, oh my God, I'm out of breath. And then later on in the run, you start to get more comfortable, and towards the end, you're like, oh man, I could keep running, but I'm already almost done running. Well, if you had that feeling, it's pretty normal, and it happens to a lot of people. And the reason is you did not properly warm up beforehand. And that's why you got so breathless in the beginning, because your body was not used to that higher amount of CO2. Because as soon as you start jogging, your body starts producing CO2, and then your breathing starts increasing, and your body's not used to that. And then towards the end of the run, your body starts to get used to that higher amount of CO2 that's in your body, and then you can breathe normally. And this is actually why most asthma attacks happen in the first 10 minutes of a workout. Because for an asthma patient, this is going to be about 3 times worse than a normal person, that feeling of breathlessness. So this is why it's really important to warm up. So this is a good warm-up you can do, and it's going to help simulate that high altitude training. So first, you're just going to walk. You're going to walk for about 1 minute, and you want to focus on just relaxing all of your muscles in your entire body. After 1 minute, you want to take a normal inhale and then an exhale. After the exhale, again, pinch your nose. If you're around people, then you don't have to pinch your nose, but just hold your breath and walk about 10 to 30 steps. Now, you don't have to walk exactly this amount of steps. If you have to walk less, you can. Just keep doing this until you have about a moderate to strong urge to breathe. Once you have that strong urge to breathe, you can let go of your nose and you can start breathing through your nose again. Then you're going to recover for about 1 minute, and then you're going to repeat this. You can do this about 5 to 10 times, and this is going to be a good warm-up to condition your body to higher levels of CO2 before your workout. Now, similar to your warm-up, you can apply this breath holding to your actual workout. So this can be done during your running or your cycling or your rowing or whatever workout that you're doing. So now instead, let's say you're jogging. You're going to basically do the same thing. You're going to exhale. You're going to hold your breath as many paces as you can until you have a moderate urge to breathe. Now, it's really important here to not overdo it because you might start to feel lightheaded or dizzy. And if these symptoms get too bad, you might want to just abandon the whole exercise and just recover your breathing and then try again. But you're going to do this until you have a moderate to strong urge to breathe, and then you're going to recover for a minute, and then you're going to repeat this. You got to do this about 10 times during your workout to get a really good effect. And you'll notice that the more you do this, the more comfortable you'll get. And it may take a few weeks for you to actually get more comfortable. But after a few weeks, you can start to increase the amount of steps that you're doing while breath holding. Now, you can also apply this high altitude training when you're just relaxing at home. So the way to do that is, again, to first focus on your breathing. So you want to kind of see how much air do you normally take in and out. So you can put your hand over your stomach again and then try to breathe in and out and see how much a volume of air that you're breathing. Then you want to try to reduce that. So you want to try to reduce the amount of air that you're breathing in to about 3/4 of what you normally do, and then keep breathing like that for a little bit. And then you're going to notice that you basically have this air hunger. You're going to have this shortage of air. And that means that you're actually doing this correctly. Now, you want to try to keep this up for about 5 to 10 minutes. At first, it may be hard. You may not even be able to get 1 minute, and that's normal. But the more you do it, the more your body will build up that CO2 tolerance and be able to do this longer. Now, all of these things are going to help to improve not just your VO2 max, but your overall life, because increasing your oxygen and increasing your oxygen capacity, or the amount of oxygen that can go to all the different cells, will help you in so many different ways. One thing our ancestors did not need to learn is how to breathe properly. Unfortunately, in our modern society, there are so many things that have changed in such a short amount of time that has really negatively affected our breathing. These are things that a lot of our ancestors did not deal with. These are things like chronic stress, living a sedentary lifestyle, or basically being lazy. Also eating unhealthy diets, like more processed foods. I mean, how many people do you know that regularly eat fast food? Because I know a ton. And also, believe it or not, living in a clean and safe home will also negatively affect our breathing. Now, some of these things you can't even avoid. I mean, how can you avoid living in your house? But some of these things you can change. Our ancestors, on the other hand, were very different than us. They had to hunt for their food. So they were always physically active, no matter what. Every day was moving. And also, they ate more natural foods. I mean, they had no processed foods back then. There was no McDonald's, no KFC. Those weren't even options. Now compare a hunter-gatherer back in the day to an average person now, with this dad bod, eating potato chips, sitting on the couch, or slouched over on their office desk. The result from all these changes is that a lot of us have become chronic overbreathers, or we're breathing way more than our body physically needs. And this will lead to a whole list of negative effects to our body. Just like you can be eating too much or drinking too much water, you can also be breathing too much air. And there's a lot of cases of unexplainable things that can happen to your body by simply breathing too much. And these are things like being out of shape, or having asthma, or having anxiety, and also chronically being tired, having insomnia, having heart problems, and even obesity. So one thing that happens when you breathe too much is you have reduced blood flow. So the blood that's flowing in your body will actually go down, and actually by quite a bit. If you start to overbreathe or start to hyperventilate and breathe really quickly for just 2 minutes, and maybe even less than that, you can start to feel really dizzy and really lightheaded, and you're going to get less blood flowing to different organs, like even your brain. So one interesting thing that a guy named Dr. Daniel Gibbs found, and this was posted in the American Journal of Psychiatry, he found that when people breathe too much, that their blood vessels will actually constrict. And it can actually constrict by as much as 50% in some people. Now, if you remember from geometry, that means that your blood flow will reduce to only a quarter of what it was before. Now, you might be wondering, how could it reduce to a quarter if it shrunk by half? Well, there's an interesting equation called pi r squared. So when you shrink that radius by 50%, then you have to square that to see how much actual blood flow is being reduced. So these people's blood flow, by simply breathing too much, their blood flow went down to a quarter of what it could be. Now that can have disastrous effects on our entire body. But the main effect this is going to have is you're going to have less oxygen. And it's not because you're not breathing enough oxygen in the air. It's going to be because you're not having enough oxygen being carried around your body. And this is why people who breathe too much, they are having so many issues, like having chronically being tired, or chronically having anxiety, or other issues. And this is a big problem for people who regularly breathe through their mouth, because people who breathe through their mouth will generally breathe way too excessively compared to people who generally breathe through their nose. And this is also the reason why people who breathe through their mouth, especially when sleeping, they wake up and they never feel fully rested. No matter how many hours of sleep they get, they still wake up tired, they wake up groggy. It takes them a few hours to get back into the zone of actually being awake and being alert. And they also wake up with a dry mouth and dry throat and all the other negative effects of mouth breathing. There are many studies that show that mouth breathers, whether you're awake or whether you're asleep, it's going to negatively affect you in so many ways. And it all comes down to breathing too much. So it can actually reduce people's concentration, people's focus goes down. Also, their productivity goes down. They also generally are in worse moods overall. Like, when people are hangry, they're like that all the time. And mouth breathers also get tired faster than people who are nose breathers. Now, if you look back at all the information, it makes sense, right? Because when you're chronically overbreathing and you're getting this reduced blood flow and this reduced amount of oxygen delivered all over your body, then obviously it's going to affect your body. And it would make sense why it affects pretty much every system, whether it's affecting your mood and your cognition or affecting how tired you are. And this is the same reason why professions that involve a lot of talking, people generally feel really tired after work. So people like teachers or salesmen or podcasters, they generally feel really tired after, because when you're talking, your breathing also increases and you're again over-breathing. And the difference with over-breathing when you're talking too much versus over-breathing when you're exercising is when you're working out, that's a justified need to breathe more because your body needs more oxygen to produce more energy for your workout. But when you're talking in front of a classroom or when I'm doing a podcast and I'm talking so much, my body does not need that extra oxygen. There's no justification for it because I don't need that extra energy. But this is why people who talk too much, they feel really tired after, because it changes their blood gases and it ends up reducing the amount of oxygen that's being delivered to all of your cells. It's basically like hyperventilating for a long period of time and then seeing how you feel after. This is why for a lot of people, focusing on reducing the amount of breathing that they're doing throughout the day is going to help them so much. So the main ways to do that is to only use your nose to breathe. So this is especially true when you're not working out, but also when you're sleeping. So a way to do that is actually to simply tape your mouth shut when you're sleeping. And you can get literally any tape on Amazon. I recently got one that's called a 3M micropore paper tape. This is basically a surgeon's tape, and it's very safe for the skin, and it's very easy to use. You just rip a piece off and put it over your lips. You don't need to get any of those fancy tapes out there. Simply using a surgical tape like this will get the job done, and it's way cheaper. But if you only use your nose and you reduce the amount of breathing that you're doing, it's actually gonna increase the amount of oxygen that's going to all of your cells. And it may sound counterintuitive because when you're short of oxygen and short of oxygen going to your cells, it would make sense to take big gulps of air. But what you're doing is you're actually getting rid of a molecule called CO2. The CO2 is basically that waste product that you breathe out. But when you breathe too quickly and you breathe too much, you're expelling too much of that CO2. Now, CO2 has a lot of benefits for our body. Our CO2 is basically what controls our blood pH, or how acidic our blood is. So our blood pH has to stay between a level of 7.35 to 7.45. That number is very important because if it gets too high or if it gets too low, then we can actually die. So our body's going to do everything it possibly can to retain this pH, or blood acidity. But the problem is if we lose too much of our CO2, then our body cannot control our blood pH as much. And that's why it has to resort to other measures to try to force our pH to stay the same. And that's why everything starts to shrink. That's why our breathing tubes start to shrink. That's why our blood vessels start to shrink. And in turn, our oxygen carrying capacity goes lower and we get less oxygen to our cells. So it's not just about one thing. You have to make sure everything, our whole body, stays in homeostasis. And the best way to make sure you have enough CO2 is to try reducing the volume of air that you're breathing. Almost every athlete in America is making huge mistakes with their breathing, and it's killing their performance. And it's not just any athlete. Even elite athletes are making these same mistakes with their breathing. So what if I told you there's a way to quickly double your performance, but also use less effort? You can do this